A couple of videos ago I showed you guys how I painted the leather cape of Abaddon the Despoiler, and today I will show you how I painted everything else, paying some special attention to the environmental lines around the model.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Balance Miniatures.
Abaddon was one of my first purchases back when I started painting. He's one of the best character models Games Workshop has ever done in my opinion, and one of my favorite characters in the lore as well, so I just had to have him.
But after building and priming him, I felt that I was just not good enough of a painter at the time to do him justice. So he was just sitting there on the shelf until now at least, and the jury is still out whether I have actually managed to do him justice, but maybe you guys can tell me after you watch the video.
And with that, let's jump right into the painting.
The cape is already finished, and as I mentioned earlier, there is a dedicated video on the channel already about it, so if you want to catch up with how I did that, I'll chuck that video in the corner and also into the video description. After the cape, the first thing I started painting was Drach'nyen, Abaddon's demon sword. And the reason I started with this is because I had this idea that I wanted the sword to emit a strong blue glow, bathing the whole side of the model in this eerie, evil light. And in order to paint the OSL effect, I wanted to have the source first so I can paint in the lights around it. But like most plans, it didn't fully survive contact with the enemy. I ended up not liking the very strong OSL in the end and dialed it back quite a bit. But this also gave me the idea to add some additional environmental lights to replace it, as you will see later.
The sword itself also gave me more trouble than expected. The painting process was quite simple, but only up to the point where I wanted to paint the demon faces on the blade.
First I covered everything in deep rusto from Chimera Colors as a base layer. The dark purple color is a good base for the turquoise I wanted to use later. Then I started mixing sea blue into the deep rusto and marked the lights on the blade. This is a demon sword with its own inner lights, so the lights can be anywhere really, so I placed them in a way to create lots of contrast. Which in practice means that if there is a light area on the one side of the blade, there should be a corresponding dark area next to it on the other side, so they contrast with each other. After that, it was just a matter of applying multiple coats to achieve full coverage and then mixing in a bit more sea blue, using the new mix on a smaller area, brightening highlight zones further and also highlighting all the edges. Once I reached pure sea blue, I started mixing in some whites to go even higher in brightness. So everything was quite straightforward so far, but the problem was painting the faces. Usually I can be quite precise with my edge highlights when I want to, but I just couldn't get the outlines of those faces right. I'm not sure why exactly, but my theory, or my excuse depending on how you want to look at it, is that it has to do with how soft and rounded the sculpted details were. At some point I started to lose patience, so I just left them imperfect and resolved to come back later with a clear head. But the inside of the faces also gave me some trouble, to be honest. I guess I was just not feeling this sword thing. I painted the inside with pure whites to create a nice bright base for a glow effect first. And then I tried various different ways to paint the faces, first with some aromatic blue contrast through the airbrush, which just didn't look right, and then blue fluo paint, which was not the right color, and then turquoise ink, which turned out too dark, and finally aromatic blue contrast again, but simply with a brush. And this last one finally looked the way I imagined, except that it was much less bright than it should be for a big OSL effect, which was one of the reasons I ended up dialing back the lights around the sword later on.
Alright, the sword was 80% done and I would come back later to tidy it up a bit, so now it was time to move on to one of the main attractions of the model, the gold armor trim. Remember that at this point I still wanted to go for a relatively large turquoise OSL from the sword, and I had no plans to have any other lights on the model. So essentially I was planning to have the ambient zenithal light coming from above, basically the sun, and then the OSL from the blade. The idea with the red glow effects and the firelight that you can see on the end result came later, as you will see as you keep watching.
So the initial idea for the gold trim was to make it super saturated old gold, so it would contrast with the desaturated black armor and the cold blue turquoise glow of the sword. And to achieve that I started with some Cartacci red, mixing in some black to darken it down a bit. I painted the entire trim with this to serve as my base and the darkest shadow. Then I moved on to red oxide and started marking the lights with it. This is a warm orangish brown color, so it's perfect for the kind of gold that I wanted to go for. The main light was meant to come from above and slightly from Abaddon's left, so knowing this, it was easy to paint the light areas. The trickiest parts were the demon face on his left knee and the smaller one on his chest. Those have a lot of details that are a bit more difficult to interpret. At this point I also realized that I needed to come up with a better way to attach the model to the painting handle since it was slipping all the time, and that's why you can see him now pinned to a piece of cork. It's surprising how much little things like this can matter. If I had him pinned like this, maybe painting the sword would have been easier as well. But moving on with the gold, the next color I used was Gold 79 from Chimera Colors, using it to go up in brightness in the light areas and to mark all the edges. And this is the point where I wanted to establish the secondary highlights for the sword OSL on the gold. So far I left the side of the gold elements facing the sword in shadow, and now I used blue sky plus some black to create the highlights. With object source lighting, the source of the light, the sword in this case, has to be always brighter than the light it creates. So theoretically, if the highest lights I used on the sword were sea blue mixed with white, then I have to keep the reflections on the armor below that in brightness. That's why I started by mixing the black into the sea blue and then went up in brightness only up to pure sea blue without any white mixed in. I also went too far following the original plan for the large OSL, but later I came back and dialed the size of the reflections back quite a bit. With that done, I continued highlighting the gold first with a mix of Gold 79 and warm yellow and white. And the reason for this complicated mix is to preserve the warmth of the armor while also going up in brightness. If I mix in only white, it will increase the brightness but will kill the saturation. But the warm yellow alone won't allow me to go and increase the brightness enough. And of course I couldn't resist using my favorite gold color for non-metallic metal, so I continued highlighting with Sahara Yellow from AK Interactive. And because I wasn't entirely happy with the result, I used some mixes of warm yellow plus white and finally even some sunray plus white in small quantities, almost to the point of just stippling it in the highest highlights.
At this point I wasn't really happy with how things were going, so I decided to rethink my approach. I searched the net for some references and I found one Abaddon standing in an ocean of blood. I didn't particularly like how it was painted, but I loved the idea. It was just the right amount of over-the-top craziness that suited the character. So now that I knew that I wanted him to be surrounded by blood, I thought, why not have a red environmental light on him to compete with the blue of the sword? Why is the red blood giving up light? I don't know. Maybe it's evil warp magic or simply a zenithal light bouncing on the red blood. I'll just call the rule of cool on this one.
Now that I had a plan, it was time to put it into action. I loaded the airbrush with some Kartachi red and sprayed the red glow effect on the armor. I painted this on the surfaces facing down towards the ground and mostly on the opposite side of things where I would want the turquoise light from the sword to show up. I also decided that the typical chaos red glow around the face of Abaddon coming from his armor would work really well with the red environmental glow I had in mind, so I sprayed this entire area around the face red as well. I was much happier with how things were looking after this. I needed to still tidy up the results a bit and paint back some of the highlights I lost on the gold, but things were looking up. It was time to move on to some of the other elements on the model.
I went for the metal elements, the face and the black armor next.
For the metals, I wanted to go for something bluish to contrast with the red, orange and yellow of the gold. And this was pretty standard on metallic metal, except for the claws, which I needed to make quite fancy since they are so prominent on the model. I started by painting mostly everything with dark Prussian blue as a base coat and darkest shadow, but on some of the elements, like the spears, for example, sticking out of the Despoiler's shoulder rack, I went with a whole red undercoat instead of the blue to create a more rusty, corroded feeling. The next step was anthracite grey, to highlight all the edges and mark the highlights on everything, regardless whether it was undercoated with blue or with whole red. Then it was just a matter of increasing the brightness further and further in the highlights, first with French blue, then pale blue, and finally with silver grey. On the claws I spent a lot more time than on anything else, but using the same colors. On the sides of the blades that are facing up, I created two highlights, a bigger one and a smaller one, and made them significantly brighter than the ones facing down. The ground-facing edges and surfaces also got a secondary highlight, but much less bright than the ones facing up, and this secondary highlight was also red, done with some Cartouche red glazes to show the reflected environmental glow. I was doing a lot of glazing back and forth to create more or less smooth transitions on the blades, and spent quite a bit of time doing the edge highlights as well, since those are essential to make the blades look sharp and metallic.
Looking back, the logical step would have been to move on to the black armor next, because I would be using very similar colors to the steel elements, but I was trying to put off doing the black since that seemed like the most intimidating part of the mini. So ironically, I moved on to painting the face instead.
Here I wanted to preserve the evil red glow that is emanating from the armor around the head, so I started with salmon skin and painted it only in the planes of light, like the cheeks, the forehead, the nose, but making sure that I don't cover the red in the shadows, especially on the surfaces pointing down. Once I established the lights with salmon skin, I started to mix in more and more sunray and kept highlighting until I reached almost pure sunray, which I only stippled in the highest highlight spots, like on the top left of the forehead, for example. Finally, I took some laser yellow and glazed very thinly over the midtones, but without covering the highest highlights whenever I could help it. This helps smoothing out the transitions and adds an interesting tone into the skin, which makes it look a bit more natural.
At this point, I just had to face the music and actually paint the black armor, which turned out to be much easier than I thought in the end. Turns out that under all the trim and ornaments, there is a surprisingly small amount of actual black surface to paint.
I used a mix of silver grey mixed with some carbon black from Chimera to start edge highlighting all the black panels, and then started to add less and less black while continuing to edge highlight, but mostly concentrating on the most visible edges that were facing up. In addition to the edge highlights, I also added some small scratches and imperfections with the same colors, and on the side of Abaddon's left leg, which is basically the biggest visible black surface on the model, I also created a scratchy volumetric highlight. I intentionally went overboard with the brightness a bit because now in the next step I wanted to tone it down and also integrate the armor with the environmental lights. First I used some turquoise ink to glaze over the highlights that are close to and facing the sword. This gives a slight bluish tint to the armor there and makes the edges glow even more bluish. Then I glazed some Cartacci red into the areas which I already marked with the airbrush, like the inside of the leg, under the claws and under the arms, for example. In most places the red was already visible from the airbrush glazes, but I wanted to make it more visible and colorful.
Now I had only 2 more big elements to paint and a ton of small details that I won't bore you with right now. If you are interested in any of those, then let me know in the comments below. So let's move on to the base to complete our remaining light sources. I still had to create the actual blood on the base because so far I only assumed it would be there and painted its reflections. But before doing that I realized that there should be one more obvious source of light on this model, the torch burning behind the Despoiler. It would have been weird for me to represent the light from the blood and the sword but not from the torch, so I took care of that first. For some reason I decided to do the light reflections before creating the source of the light on the torch, so I loaded some whole red into the airbrush and shot it from the direction of the torch onto the cape and Abaddon's left leg from below. These would be the objects closest to the light where the OSL should be obvious. Then I replaced the whole red with Cartacci red in the airbrush and sprayed this in the middle of the whole red, trying to concentrate it onto the elements that would be the closest to the torch. And later, while painting the torch, I also took some orange paint and highlighted the most prominent edges inside this red glow. And to prepare for painting the red ocean of blood, I first sprayed the base around the sculpted details with burnt red and Cartacci red over the terrain paste I used earlier, and then painted over that with some Blood Angels red contrast to create more color and some shading. While this was drying, I could work on the torch. Painting the torch itself is quite straightforward. When it comes to highlights, fire behaves exactly the opposite to everything else. Instead of starting with dark and finishing with light, you need to do the opposite, since the fire is hottest and therefore brightest at the center of the flame and the coldest and therefore the darkest at its edges. Keeping this in mind, I first painted the whole flame white. I wanted to have a lot of vivid colors with fluorescent paints, which is only really possible over white. I painted the entire surface with fluorescent yellow first, with lots of layers for full coverage. Then I switched to orange fluo next and painted only the raised elements, leaving the yellow in the recesses where normally you would have the shadows. Next I went with red fluo and used it only on the raised elements but on a smaller surface than before with the orange and concentrating more towards the end of the flame. The next layer I did with burnt red, making this even smaller and even more concentrated towards the end. Finally, I kept adding black to the burnt red until I ended up with pure black at the very tip of the flame. Now the only thing left to do was the blood. The contrast paint had dried nicely and now I used the red from Chimera to increase the highlights on the area even more. I needed the contrast to be high so it would be visible even under the layers of half-transparent liquid I wanted to use. Then I took some transparent water paste from AK Interactive and mixed it with a small amount of Blood Angels red contrast paint. The paste itself is completely white and I only used enough Blood Angels red to make it look pinkish. I wanted to make sure that the water has a red tint, but it wouldn't completely obscure what is underneath. I applied it on the base and hoped for the best, because this was the first time I ever used this product, not to mention mixing it with contrast paints. The theory seemed solid, but I wasn't sure what the end product would look like. Fortunately, the first layer looked almost exactly like I imagined, so now I just had to wait until it fully dried and add 2 more layers to make the blood level as high as I wanted it to be on the base. Finally, all I had to do was to add Abaddon to the base, make a couple of small corrections like adding some white glints to the metals here and there and correcting some of the details on that sword, and the end result looks like this. thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and maybe learned something new that you can use for your own projects as well. Let me know in the comments whether I managed to do the War Master justice and what you would have done differently. Don't forget to smash all of those usual buttons, and see you guys in the next one.